The Omega sat in the Lycan King's seat by mistake, and he named her his fated mate. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, back to our main character. Elena Harper had learned early how to make herself small, how to move through the Lycan court like a shadow that left no trace, because an Omega without a pack name or title survived by being invisible. The grand hall stretched nearly the length of a football field, its stone floor polished to a mirror-like sheen, reflecting torchlight and moonlight until the air itself felt bright and heavy with expectation. Tonight was not meant for her. Tonight belonged to alphas, nobles, and the ancient laws that ruled them all. At the center of the hall stood the Lycan King's seat, raised on a shallow dais, carved from dark wood older than the city itself, its presence commanding silence even when the hall was full. Everyone knew the rule. No one sat there unless summoned. No one even brushed against it by accident. Elena knew this better than anyone, because fear had taught her to memorize every boundary. She carried a silver tray with steady hands, eyes lowered, counting her steps in inches so she wouldn't drift too close to the forbidden space. Around her, murmurs rose and fell like a distant tide as the court gathered, scents of pine oil, cold stone, and night air blending together. She felt the weight of hundreds of eyes that never truly saw her, felt the pressure of rank pressing down like an invisible ceiling. When a sudden shift in the crowd rippled outward, Elena reacted on instinct, pivoting to avoid a collision, her foot catching on the edge of a rug she hadn't noticed. The world tilted. The tray slipped. Time stretched thin and breathless as she reached for balance, her heart pounding loud enough that she was sure the hall could hear it. She landed hard, the impact jarring, and for a single impossible second, everything went silent. The cold, solid feel beneath her palms was wrong. The height was wrong. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. Elena realized, with a slow, sinking certainty, that she was no longer on the floor. She was seated on the Lycan King's seat. Gasps spread through the hall like sparks across dry leaves. Elena's skin went cold, her pulse thudding in her ears, as she froze where she was, too afraid to move, too afraid to stand. She could feel the throne beneath her, firm and unyielding, as if it had been waiting. Somewhere in the vast space above her, footsteps approached, unhurried and impossibly calm. The presence that followed carried weight, not loud or violent, but absolute, like gravity deciding which way was down. Elena lowered her head, fingers curling against the armrest, preparing herself for judgment she believed she deserved, unaware that the moment meant to end her quiet existence was about to redefine it entirely. The silence did not break all at once, but cracked slowly, like ice under careful pressure, as whispers crept along the edges of the grand hall and died the moment they reached the center where Elena Harper sat frozen in place, her heart racing faster than she thought possible. She could feel the weight of the Lycan King's seat beneath her, solid and ancient, and that knowledge pressed against her chest until breathing felt like an effort. Every lesson she had ever learned screamed at her to move, to stand, to flee, but fear held her still, because any motion now could be mistaken for defiance. She kept her eyes down, fixed on the polished stone inches below the dais, aware of the sudden distance between herself and the floor she belonged on. Around her, the court seemed to pull back without anyone actually stepping away, a clear circle forming as if instinct itself demanded space. Elena sensed the judgment before she heard it, not shouted or spoken, but carried in the subtle shifts of posture and scent, the unspoken agreement that an Omega had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. She heard someone inhale sharply to her left, another murmur quickly silenced, and then the soft scrape of boots against stone announced movement that mattered. The presence she felt then was unlike anything she had known, not loud or threatening, but steady and undeniable, like standing too close to the edge of a cliff and knowing gravity would decide everything. The footsteps drew nearer, measured and unhurried, each one echoing through her in a way that made her shoulders tense. Elena swallowed, her mouth dry, and folded her hands in her lap. A small gesture of surrender she hoped would be seen for what it was. She had not meant to disrespect anyone. She had not meant to sit there. She had only tried to stay out of the way, as she always did. The air grew warmer as the figure stopped directly in front of her, close enough that she could sense him without looking, close enough that the hall itself seemed to lean in. Elena forced herself to breathe slowly, counting each inhale the way she had learned to do when panic threatened to take over, telling herself that panic would not save her now. She felt eyes on her from every direction, some sharp with anticipation, others uneasy, a few openly curious, but none kind enough to meet her gaze. A memory surfaced of being told, years ago, that the Lycan King's seat was not merely a symbol but a test, that it responded only to what belonged near it, and she almost laughed at the thought because she was the least fitting person in the room. Her fingers tightened together, knuckles pale, as she waited for the sentence she was certain would come. The silence stretched longer than she expected, long enough for her to wonder if she had misjudged the distance of time itself, long enough for doubt to flicker where fear had been absolute. She felt something then, subtle but unmistakable, like a shift in the air that brushed against her senses and lingered, not painful or frightening, but strangely grounding. Elena did not understand it, only knew that it made her breathing easier and her racing heart slow by degrees. The figure before her remained still, and the stillness carried intent rather than hesitation. Somewhere high above, moonlight filtered through tall windows and traced the edges of the dais, catching on her hair and the carved lines of the throne alike. Elena remained seated, head bowed, waiting for the world to tell her who she was allowed to be, unaware that the rules she feared were already bending around her. Elena felt the moment before it happened, a subtle change in the air that brushed against her senses like a held breath finally released, and then a voice spoke, low and steady, carrying easily across the vast space of the grand hall without ever rising in volume. It was a voice that did not need to command because it assumed obedience as a natural state. Elena's shoulders tightened as the sound reached her, and she lowered her head further, her gaze fixed on the edge of the dais, every instinct urging her to disappear. The voice did not accuse or condemn. Instead, it asked a simple question, calm and deliberate, asking who she was and why she sat where she did. The simplicity of it made her chest ache more than any shouted judgment could have. Elena swallowed and answered honestly, her voice quiet but clear, explaining that her name was Elena Harper, that she was an Omega assigned to serve the hall, and that she had stumbled. She did not offer excuses or plead for mercy. She stated the truth and waited. The pause that followed felt longer than the moments before, stretching until it pressed against her thoughts, filling them with memories of being overlooked, corrected, and quietly reminded of her place. She expected the court to erupt then, for others to speak over her, but no one dared interrupt. The presence before her shifted slightly, and Elena sensed the tension sharpen rather than soften. She felt it like a line drawn straight through her, not invasive, but thorough, as if she were being seen fully for the first time. When the voice spoke again, it was closer now, no longer addressing the room but her alone, asking her to lift her head. Elena hesitated, fear flickering through her, then obeyed, raising her gaze just enough to meet a pair of eyes the color of winter steel. King Rowan Blackwood stood before her, exactly as the stories described and nothing like them at the same time, tall and composed, his expression unreadable yet focused entirely on her. She felt suddenly exposed, not because of judgment, but because something in his attention made hiding impossible. He studied her for a moment that seemed suspended outside time, and Elena felt a strange warmth settle in her chest, steadying her breathing without effort. Around them, the hall remained silent, as if the walls themselves were listening. Rowan asked another question, this one quieter, about whether she understood the meaning of the seat she occupied. Elena nodded and answered yes, admitting that she knew the law and that she accepted whatever consequence followed. Her honesty did not waver, even as her hands trembled slightly in her lap. The king's gaze did not harden at her words. Instead, something unreadable passed through his eyes, like recognition rather than anger. He stepped closer, close enough that Elena could sense his presence clearly, not overwhelming, but certain, and she noticed then that the fear knotting her stomach had loosened without her realizing it. Rowan looked from her to the throne and back again, as though measuring something only he could see. When he spoke next, his words were not directed at her alone but carried outward, addressed to the entire court, reminding them of the ancient laws that governed the Lycan seat, laws older than any living memory. Elena listened, her heart pounding, certain she was about to be named as an example. Instead, the words took a turn she had not anticipated, focusing not on punishment but on purpose, on the idea that power responded to truth rather than rank. Elena felt the room shift, tension rippling outward, as Rowan finished speaking and returned his attention to her, his expression composed, his voice calm as he asked her to remain where she was. Confusion flickered through her fear, tentative and fragile, as she realized that whatever judgment was coming, it was not following the path she had prepared herself for, and the life she had known moments ago was already slipping quietly out of reach. The words that followed did not thunder or strike, yet they carried a weight that settled over the court and refused to lift, as King Rowan Blackwood addressed those gathered with a calm certainty that left no room for interruption. He spoke of order and tradition, of the purpose behind rules that had guided Lycan kind for generations, and as he did, Elena felt the attention of the room shift from her alone to the space between her and the king, as if something unseen but important stood there. She remained seated, hands folded, back straight despite the tremor in her limbs, listening carefully, knowing that every syllable mattered. Rowan did not raise his voice, but his presence filled the hall, and when he paused, the silence felt deliberate, rather than tense. From the edges of the room, a few alphas stirred, their discomfort evident in the way they shifted their weight or glanced toward one another, but none stepped forward. Elena sensed their unease without looking, understood it instinctively, because her existence had always made others uncomfortable in quieter ways. The king turned his attention back to her, his gaze steady, and asked if she feared the consequences of her mistake. The question caught Elena off guard, not because she did not fear them, but because she had never been asked to name that fear aloud. She answered honestly, admitting that she did, but that fear did not change what had happened, and that she accepted responsibility for where she sat. Her voice did not shake this time, and she was faintly surprised by that. Rowan listened without reacting, as though weighing not just her words but the intent behind them, and Elena felt again that strange sensation of being seen rather than judged. He acknowledged her acceptance with a slight nod, then shifted his focus outward, reminding the court that law existed to serve the realm, not to satisfy pride or expectation. The reminder landed like a quiet challenge, and Elena felt the room respond, tension tightening rather than releasing. Someone near the front cleared their throat, a sound that echoed too loudly in the stillness, but the king lifted a hand, silencing any attempt to speak. Elena's heart beat faster at the gesture, not with fear this time, but with a growing sense that the moment had moved beyond her control entirely. Rowan took a step closer to the dais, close enough that Elena could sense the warmth of his presence, and he studied the throne once more, his expression thoughtful rather than severe. He spoke again, this time about intention, about how accidents revealed truths as often as they caused harm, and Elena struggled to follow the meaning behind his words, certain they were not meant for her alone. The court listened, rigid and attentive, as if afraid to miss something crucial. Elena's thoughts drifted briefly to the life she had known before this night, to the small routines that had defined her days, and she felt a pang of loss for something she could not yet name. When Rowan asked her to stand, her breath caught, but she complied, rising carefully from the seat she had never meant to occupy. The moment she stepped away, the air seemed to shift again, lighter and heavier all at once, and Elena wondered if she had imagined the subtle sense of belonging she had felt while seated there. She stood before the king, hands clasped, eyes level with his chest, waiting. Rowan regarded her in silence, then spoke with measured clarity, stating that no judgment would be passed until the truth of the moment was fully understood. The declaration sent a ripple through the hall, quiet but unmistakable, and Elena felt it pass through her as well, a current of uncertainty threaded with something like hope. She did not dare to assume what it meant, only knew that the path ahead was no longer straight or familiar, and that the choice she thought she had already made might not be the final one after all. The court remained suspended in a careful stillness as King Rowan Blackwood turned slightly, his attention shifting from Elena to the gathered Lycan nobility, and the movement alone was enough to command absolute focus. He spoke again, his tone even and unhurried, explaining that the throne was not merely a seat of authority but a living symbol bound to the balance of the realm, one that responded to intent rather than accident. Elena listened from where she stood, her pulse steadying as the meaning of his words unfolded, realizing that he was not defending her mistake, but redefining it. The king's gaze returned to her, direct but not unkind, and he asked her to describe what she had felt when she fell into the seat. The question surprised her, not because it was difficult, but because no one had ever asked her to speak about her experience as though it mattered. Elena hesitated only a moment before answering, choosing honesty over caution, explaining that she had felt fear at first, then something else she could not name, a sense of quiet that settled inside her chest despite everything. A murmur rippled through the hall at her words, quickly silenced as Rowan lifted his hand again. He did not look away from her as he acknowledged her answer, as if it confirmed something he had already suspected. The king stepped closer, stopping at a respectful distance, and Elena became acutely aware of how calm she felt in his presence, a contrast to the fear she had lived with for so long. Rowan addressed the court once more, stating that such reactions to the throne were rare and meaningful, and that history held more than one account of destiny revealing itself through disruption rather than ceremony. Elena felt the weight of every eye in the room return to her, not sharp with judgment now, but searching, uncertain. She fought the instinct to shrink back, reminding herself to stand as she was, neither pleading nor defensive. Rowan's attention shifted again, this time inward, and for a brief moment, his expression softened in a way few had ever witnessed. He spoke quietly, almost thoughtfully, about bonds that formed beyond expectation, about the way fate often chose humility over power as its messenger. The words sent a subtle stir through the hall, discomfort mixing with curiosity among those who had never considered such a possibility. Elena felt a gentle warmth spread through her, not overwhelming, but steady, as if something long dormant had begun to wake. The king noticed it too, his eyes narrowing slightly, as though he sensed the same change, and he asked her to place her hand over her heart and breathe slowly. She obeyed, surprised by how natural the instruction felt, and as she did, the warmth steadied, becoming a calm presence rather than a surge. Rowan nodded once, as if satisfied, then straightened and faced the court fully. He declared that what had occurred could not be dismissed or punished without risking imbalance, and that until the truth of the bond he sensed was understood, Elena Harper would be placed under his direct protection. The declaration landed with quiet force, and Elena felt the significance of it even before the murmurs began. Protection from the Lycan King himself was not an honor granted lightly, especially to an Omega of no standing. Rowan turned back to her and spoke her name clearly, instructing her to remain close and to trust the process unfolding around her. Elena met his gaze, her fear finally giving way to a cautious resolve, aware that whatever path lay ahead was no longer something she would walk unseen. The throne loomed behind them, silent and watchful, as if it too had recognized a shift that could not be undone. The shift that followed was subtle but unmistakable, like a quiet tide turning beneath still water, as Elena remained at. King Rowan Blackwood sighed, and felt the court recalibrate around them. The murmurs faded into controlled silence, not because curiosity had lessened, but because something older than curiosity had taken hold. Rowan spoke less now, yet his presence seemed to expand, filling the space with a calm authority that steadied even Elena's thoughts. He instructed the attendants to step back, creating a respectful distance, and Elena noticed how readily they obeyed, eyes lowered, movements careful. She stood where she was told, close enough to sense the quiet strength beside her, and for the first time since entering the grand hall, she did not feel like she was in the wrong place. Rowan addressed her again, asking if she felt overwhelmed, and Elena answered truthfully that she felt uncertain, but not afraid. The admission surprised her, yet it rang true the moment she spoke it. The king acknowledged this with a small nod, then explained in measured tones that certain bonds announced themselves through harmony rather than force, through calm recognition instead of command. As he spoke, Elena felt a steady warmth return, not dramatic or consuming, but reassuring, as though something within her recognized his words and settled into them. The court listened intently, and Elena sensed resistance mingled with awe among the assembled Lycan nobles, because what Rowan described challenged long-held assumptions about rank and worth. He turned slightly, angling his body so that Elena stood within his line of sight, and the throne remained behind them both, and spoke of fate as a current that could not be redirected, only resisted at great cost. The words were not threatening, yet they carried undeniable truth. Elena became aware of how quiet the hall had grown, how even the faint echoes seemed to wait. Rowan asked her to breathe again, slowly and evenly, and as she did, the warmth steadied into something deeper, a sense of alignment that made her shoulders relax without conscious effort. He observed this closely, his gaze intent but not intrusive, and then addressed the court with a declaration that silenced any remaining doubt. He stated that what he sensed was not assumption or impulse, but recognition, a bond awakening in its own time, and that it would be honored accordingly. Elena felt the weight of his words settle over her like a mantle, heavy with responsibility, but free of fear. She noticed then that the air itself felt clearer, as if tension had been gently lifted rather than broken. Rowan turned to her once more, his voice lower now, meant for her alone, assuring her that she would not be rushed or forced, that choice and consent were as vital as destiny itself. The reassurance anchored her, and Elena met his gaze fully, seeing not just power there, but restraint and certainty balanced together. The court reacted quietly, some with bowed heads, others with thoughtful stillness, as the realization took hold that something irrevocable had begun. Rowan concluded by stating that the proceedings would pause, that reflection was required before formal recognition, and that until then, Elena Harper would remain under his personal guidance. The announcement carried finality without spectacle, and Elena understood that the true turning point had already passed. As they stood together, the throne behind them seemed less imposing and more symbolic, no longer a threat, but a witness, and Elena felt, with growing clarity, that the life she had known as an unseen Omega had ended, replaced by a path she had never imagined but was now unmistakably hers. The pause King Rowan Blackwood declared did not dissolve the moment, but sharpened it, as the grand hall settled into a charged calm, where every breath felt deliberate and every movement carried meaning. Elena stood beside him, aware of how the space responded to his authority, yet equally aware that the attention now lingered on her in a way it never had before. The court had shifted from judging an error to witnessing a transformation, and that awareness pressed against her senses with quiet intensity. Rowan turned slightly toward her, his posture open but steady, and spoke in a tone meant for all to hear, explaining that destiny, once recognized, could not be hidden without consequence. His words were measured, careful, as if he were guiding the court across a threshold rather than pushing them through it. Elena listened closely, her earlier fear replaced by a focused calm that surprised her with its strength. She realized then that the warmth she felt was no longer simply reassurance, but connection, subtle and consistent, anchoring her where she stood. Rowan extended his hand toward her, not as a command but as an invitation, and Elena hesitated only long enough to understand the significance before placing her hand in his. The contact was brief and respectful, yet it sent a quiet ripple through the hall, not dramatic or overwhelming, but undeniable. Rowan did not tighten his grip or draw her closer. He simply acknowledged the bond he sensed by naming it aloud, stating clearly that what had awakened between them was a fated recognition, rare and binding, and that he would not deny it. The words echoed through the chamber, and Elena felt their weight settle into her bones, not heavy with fear, but with truth. A collective reaction passed through the assembled Lycan nobles, some lowering their heads in acceptance, others standing rigid as they adjusted to a reality they had not anticipated. Rowan did not allow the moment to spiral into chaos. He continued, clarifying that fate did not erase choice, and that Elena Harper would not be claimed through pressure or spectacle, but honored through respect and time. Elena felt her throat tighten, not with panic, but with emotion she struggled to name, and she kept her gaze steady, meeting the eyes of those who now looked at her differently. Rowan released her hand and turned toward the throne, gesturing once to remind the court of its true purpose, not as a symbol of domination, but of unity and balance. He then faced Elena again, and, before the gathered court, named her his fated mate, his voice calm and resolute, carrying certainty without force. The declaration did not explode through the hall, but settled into it, deep and lasting, like a stone placed at the center of still water. Elena felt the reality of it unfold slowly, her thoughts aligning with the steady rhythm of her breathing, as she accepted that her life had irrevocably changed. Rowan addressed the court one final time, instructing them to stand down from judgment and prepare for transition rather than resistance, making it clear that his decision was neither impulsive nor negotiable. The authority in his tone left no room for challenge. As the court complied, Elena became aware of how the space around her felt different, less oppressive, more open, as if unseen walls had shifted. Rowan leaned slightly toward her, his voice lowered so only she could hear, reassuring her that she would be guided and protected, that her voice would matter in the days ahead. Elena nodded, her resolve steady, understanding that she had not been elevated because she stumbled into power, but because she had met it without pretense. The grand hall remained quiet as the moment concluded, not in shock, but in recognition, and Elena stood beside the Lycan King, no longer unseen, no longer out of place, as destiny settled fully into view. The aftermath unfolded quietly rather than explosively, as the court absorbed the reality of what had been declared and began to adjust its understanding of order and place. Elena stood beside King Rowan Blackwood, acutely aware of the subtle shifts around her, the way conversations stopped before they began and glances were reconsidered mid-thought. Where there had once been dismissal, there was now uncertainty, and where there had been certainty, there was reconsideration. Rowan guided her a few measured steps forward, not toward the throne, but away from it, as if signaling that the symbol no longer needed to dominate the moment. He addressed the court with composed clarity, instructing them to recognize that acknowledgement of fate did not undo their responsibilities, but reshaped them. Elena listened, her senses alert, noticing how the warmth she felt no longer pulsed but flowed steadily, grounding her as the reality of her new standing settled in. Members of the court began to lower their heads in acknowledgement, some more slowly than others, and Elena recognized a few faces that had once looked through her as though she were part of the furniture. Now their expressions held calculation, humility, or restrained curiosity. Rowan's voice carried evenly as he reminded them that respect was not granted by title alone, but by the willingness to uphold balance, and that imbalance often revealed itself through contempt. The words landed with purpose, and Elena understood that they were not spoken only for her benefit. She felt no desire for vindication, only a quiet clarity that the space she occupied was no longer accidental. Rowan turned to her briefly, asking if she wished to step away from the hall for a moment, offering choice rather than command. Elena considered the offer, then shook her head, realizing that retreat would only reinforce the idea that she did not belong. She met his gaze and answered that she would stay. The king acknowledged her decision with a subtle nod, something like approval flickering across his features. Together, they remained visible, present, allowing the court to adjust rather than escape the moment. Elena felt the significance of this choice settle into her posture, straightening her spine as she claimed her presence without defiance. Rowan resumed addressing the court, outlining the next steps with careful precision, explaining that formal proceedings would follow in time, but that for now, the priority was stability and understanding. He made it clear that Elena would be treated with full respect, neither elevated beyond reason nor diminished by old prejudice. The clarity of his words left little room for misinterpretation. Elena noticed how the air felt lighter as the tension dissipated, replaced by a cautious calm. As the court began to disperse in an orderly fashion, murmurs rising softly, Elena remained still, observing the change in how people moved around her, giving her space not out of fear, but recognition. Rowan spoke to her again, quietly this time, reassuring her that the transition would not be immediate or overwhelming, that she would be supported as she learned what this bond meant for both of them. Elena appreciated the restraint in his approach, the absence of pressure, and she felt her confidence grow in response. She glanced once toward the throne, no longer seeing it as a symbol of punishment or distance, but as a reminder of how easily assumptions could be overturned. The grand hall gradually emptied, leaving behind echoes and possibility, and Elena stood at the center of it all, no longer defined by the mistake that had brought her there, but by the truth that had emerged because of it. The grand hall felt different once the last echoes of departing footsteps faded, as if the stone itself had exhaled and settled into a quieter truth. Elena stood near the center of the space with King Rowan Blackwood, the vastness no longer pressing in on her, but opening outward, filled with possibility rather than threat. Moonlight streamed through the tall windows, laying pale paths across the floor, and Elena followed one with her eyes, thinking of how many times she had crossed this hall unseen, careful not to leave a mark. Rowan spoke softly now, his voice no longer meant for the court but for her alone, telling her that moments like this were rare not because fate was selective, but because few listened when it spoke. Elena absorbed his words, feeling their calm settle inside her, and realized that the warmth she had felt since sitting on the throne had become something steady and familiar, like a presence that had always been waiting. Rowan asked her how she felt, not as a king seeking reassurance, but as a man acknowledging change, and Elena considered the question honestly before answering that she felt grounded, surprised, and ready to learn who she was becoming. He accepted her answer without correction, a faint smile touching his expression, and guided her toward the edge of the dais where the throne loomed less like an authority and more like a witness to what had unfolded. He told her that destiny did not demand perfection, only sincerity, and that her willingness to accept consequence without bitterness had revealed more strength than defiance ever could. Elena reflected on that, understanding that her life had shifted not because she sought power, but because she had faced fear without hiding from it. Rowan paused beside her, lowering his voice further, and shared that the bond he sensed was not a chain but a connection that would grow through trust and shared choice, assuring her that her autonomy would never be eclipsed by his crown. The assurance mattered deeply, and Elena felt something inside her align, as if a question she had never known how to ask had finally been answered. They stood together in silence for a moment, not awkward or strained, but thoughtful, allowing the significance of the night to settle naturally. Elena glanced once more at the throne and understood, with quiet clarity, that it had not called her to claim power, but to recognize balance. Rowan gestured toward the hall's exit, inviting her to walk with him, not ahead or behind, but beside, and Elena matched his pace instinctively as they moved forward. Each step felt intentional, not because it was guided, but because it was chosen. As they reached the threshold, Rowan stopped and turned to her, his expression open and resolute, and spoke words meant only for her understanding, reminding her that she had not taken his seat or disrupted order, but had arrived exactly where she was meant to stand. Elena met his gaze, a sense of quiet confidence settling into her posture, and for the first time, she did not question her place. Together, they stepped beyond the hall, leaving behind the echoes of judgment and assumption, and Elena carried with her the understanding that destiny had not elevated her by accident, but had recognized her through it, opening a path forward defined not by where she came from, but by who she chose to become.